My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Welcome to the visionary world of the quantum and the dream, a journey through three remarkable shifts in consciousness. For the first time in the history of evolution, three forms of intelligence are interacting here on Earth: human intelligence, computer intelligence, and the most influential of all, nature's intelligence. My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Douglas Grunther, says a number of visionary thinkers starting in the year 1900 and crossing into this new millennium reveal underlying connections between the human mind and the patterns of nature, pointing us towards a new renaissance. Douglas Grunther is the creator-host of the Woodstock Roundtable, a rollicking and multi-award-winning radio talk show spiced with humor and informed by his love of philosophy, depth psychology, and spiritual insight. He graduated from Columbia University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar finalist. He has been the featured speaker in front of national audiences and is a DreamWork facilitator certified by Dr. Jeremy Taylor, co-founder of the International Association for the Study of Dreams. His website is douglasgrunther.com, and he joins me this week to share his new book, The Quantum and the Dream: Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Douglas Grunther. Welcome, Doug.
So great to be with you, Victor. Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for joining us today. Doug, please share with us your path and what birthed your interests in philosophy, depth psychology, and spiritual insight.
Well, I have to say it started in college when I was the first sophomore year. I was able to actually, for the first time in my educational career, choose what courses I was going to take. And so they had a student handbook published every year where students evaluated every professor. How interesting was the class? Was it more tests or papers? And I read through that really carefully. And the professor who came out to me most exciting was a philosophy professor. Now, I didn't have any particular interest in philosophy at the time, but I said, this guy sounds too good to be true. Well, he was brilliant, Charles Frankel, and he totally opened my mind to thinking about big ideas and big questions that philosophy does at its best. And I started going to the college bookstores, which were, thousands of books that I'd never even, really thought about, and would just browse and see if a book would attract me in some way. And the two thin books that attracted me the most, I had the similar reaction to, and they couldn't have been more different on one level. One was the Tao Ching, the beautiful Taoist text from thousands of years ago. And the other was Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Message. Mm. And what happened was, when I read the first page of each book while standing there in the bookstore, in both cases, I said, these may be the two most important books I ever read, and I have no idea what they're talking about. That's an interesting reaction. And I now know, 50 years later, that's because the books were connecting with the right hemisphere of my brain, not the left, which is the part of our brain that is intuitive, empathic, and can kind of find a big picture out of a complex situation. And that got me thinking in a whole new way about what's important and what's exciting. And we can talk about some of the important distinctions between the left and right hemisphere of our brains. But for me, the right hemisphere is the ultimate playground of visionary ideas and exciting new visions.
Let me ask you a quick question for those who don't know. What is depth psychology?
Depth psychology is the exploration of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And to this day, Victor, I am both amused and frustrated by the fact that while there is excellent results one can get from what's called cognitive psychology, which is the mainstream psychology, which basically says, if you're having a problem, let's get you through the day, let's get you through the next week, and get you back on your feet. And that's very important. But the unconscious, every psychologist, or virtually everyone, along with every philosopher and historian, would have to agree that the vast majority of what we think, what we perceive, what we act on, what we believe, come from the unconscious. I would say most would say it's 95 to 99% of our thinking is from the unconscious. And yet, I would ask any of your listeners, go to a bookstore, go to the psychology section. You're going to find a lot of brilliant books there. Go into the index. Most of those books won't even mention the unconscious. And so, to me, the analogy would be thinking you could understand the deep patterns of the ocean by sitting on a beach and watching the waves that crash on the shore. Right? Those waves that breach the surface were being caused by more powerful forces underneath the surface of the water that can't be seen from the beach. One has to dive down deeply to access it. And I'm saying that in the year 1900, there was a synchronicity, we can talk about what that is, which was calling on us, even to this day, to go underneath the surface of our thinking and explore the dark but fascinating and most creative parts of our minds, which is the unconscious.
You're also a certified dream work facilitator. What does this practice entail?
I was fortunate to I got interested in my dreams the same way I got interested in McLuhan and the Tao Ching. I was going through a very difficult time back in the mid 1980s, emotionally, and I went to a bookstore to try to find a book that would help me. And the book that almost jumped out at me, it seemed, was a book called Dream Work by Dr. Jeremy Taylor. And I read that book cover to cover and started using the principles in that book to start remembering more dreams, not that hard to do, and then learning their language. And within a month, the emotional issues were clearing up. And I realized, again, that the dreams, the part of our unconscious and what we call the theta brainwave state, has enormous information for us and can be a tremendous ally. And so that got me started in a love of studying dreams. And then through some good fortune, I was able to take a 2-weekend workshop in dream work with Dr. Montague Ullman, not a very well-known name, but Victor, he had one of the coolest academic titles I've ever heard. Monty, as he liked to be called, was a professor emeritus of psychiatry and parapsychology at Albert Einstein Medical College.
Wow.
Now, how's that for a title? And when I was able to talk my way into his 2-week seminar, which he did at his home at the age of 92, if we have time, I could tell you about the first dream we did as a group. It blew my mind and made me realize this is something I really want to pursue more. And then in another fortunate synchronicity, Jeremy Taylor, the man whose book I mentioned, was flown into my area by somebody who lived near in the region who had a spiritual center. And it went so successfully that she flew Jeremy in 4 weekends a year for 10 years. I went to every weekend, and I have a radio show Sunday mornings. Jeremy started on those Sundays he was here coming on the air with me. And for an hour, we would take calls from listeners where they would give us a dream and we would give them insights into that dream. So that really got me fascinated and started in doing some dream work.
Tell us about that dream you were starting to tell us about.
Oh, man. I'm still smiling at this. So this is around 2002, and Montague Ullman was a brilliant dream worker, and he had a method of doing dream work. And there were 14 of us. 12 of them were advanced psychologists, either with master's degree or PhDs. One was a budding pianist from Juilliard, and some guy from Woodstock who had a talk show somehow got in there. And he teaches us the method, and then he asks for somebody to volunteer a dream. So a woman raises her hand, and here's the dream she gave to us. I'm lying on the ground under a tree. Some leaves have fallen. There's a stream nearby. So I'm waiting for the meat of the dream, and she says, that's it. And I'm going to myself, why would somebody volunteer that dream? There's nothing to it. Well, without going into the details of how we work the dream, she now leaves the circle. We were seated in a circle on chairs. And we now, each of us voluntarily took on the dream as if it was our own. Because in Montague and Jeremy's work, they agreed, we would never say to the dreamer, I think your dream is about you and your mother. We would say, if this were my dream, this would be telling me something about me and my mother. Big difference, right?
Absolutely.
So we all start taking on the dream. And I remember one of the psychologists said, if this was my dream, that tree reminds me of the tree in Eden and Adam and Eve leaving the garden. Another one said, there's a stream nearby, and I know that often in dreams, water represents the emotions. And I remember since I love puns, and I know dreams love to pun from working my dreams, I said, if this was my dream, the leaves on the ground are what are calling to me. There's something about leaving, okay? So we all do this. Now it's time for the dreamer to come back into the circle, and she has an opportunity to either ask us questions or make comments on what we were saying. And her comment was, thank you for helping me make a life-changing decision. I'm scratching my head. And she begins to tell us that what's been going on with her is she was doing extremely well as an executive in a corporation, but she hated business life. She always wanted to be an artist, and she had talent, but her parents and extended family had always convinced her that, you can't really make a living as an artist, and you should really do something more practical. And so she felt the pressure to stay in this well-paying job, but she felt it was eating her soul, that she really wanted to be an artist. And she's listening to us talking about leaving the Garden of Eden, and a new adventure, and emotional water, and then leaving something, right? And someone else had talked about the tree feeling like the family tree. And the dream was coming, she felt, to tell her it's time to leave the pressure of the family, to stay in a job and a career that was eating her soul up. And that really blew my mind, that any dream worked on by a group could elicit that deep a message. And I can tell you from having run many dream groups, Victor, most of my dream groups don't have experts in psychology participating. This works for anybody who's willing to explore the fascinating world of dreams and learn a little bit more about how they work and how they speak to us. And again, we now know from laboratory experiments that when we dream at night, the messages percolate first into the right hemisphere of the brain before they're passed over to the left. And we can go over why that's all very important, but that's kind of I'm glad you asked me to talk about that first dream I ever worked in a dream group, because it still amazes me how powerful these dreams can be.
It must have given her great relief.
Yeah, there's another leaf, and I agree with you 100%. It certainly did.
You've also been a radio talk show host for more than 40 years and creator and host of the Woodstock Roundtable Show. Where may we hear this show, and who are some of the guests you featured?
Well, Radio Woodstock is a licensed FM radio station, which when I got into radio in 1980 was the only way you could be on radio. Now, of course, thanks to the World Wide Web, shows like yours, we have thousands and thousands of podcasts that are, have as many, if not more, listeners than certain radio shows. But I've been on the Woodstock radio station. I helped start it back in 1980. The talk show is called the Woodstock Roundtable. It's a weekly show. And like you, Victor, we're two peas in a pod, to go back to the leaf and tree stuff. I thought I was getting to radio because that was going to be my only career. It's been a favorite part of my career. But what I really realized is I wanted a talk show so I could learn more.
Yeah.
And so to me, having a talk show on a station which gives me the freedom to run it any way I choose, I feel like I'm running a college where I get to choose the professors and what courses I take. So we've had a lot of fun because one of my philosophies is that as serious as life is, and we certainly are living in a very complex, chaotic, and anxiety-ridden time, one of the things that make us human is our ability to laugh. And so on my show, I love getting serious and as deep into the human psyche as we can, but never forget to have a good time and have a few laughs.
Absolutely. It's interesting that in the introduction to your new book, The Quantum and the Dream, there's a quote from Robert Thurman referring to you as Radio Bodhisattva. Did he mean that you will do your shows until all of humanity has reached enlightenment? Is that what he's saying?
I wouldn't want that pressure. Bob Thurman is a force of nature. Robert Thurman is a world-renowned Buddhist teacher. He was the first Westerner ordained by the Dalai Lama, is a personal friend and consultant to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and grew up and lives in Woodstock. And so one of my previous producers knew him tangentially and somehow convinced him to come on my show, and we hit it off. And so for the past 20 years, he's been coming on a couple times a year, and he's always been my last guest of the year. And he's written a lot of beautiful books, gives talk. I mean, you can go to YouTube. He's all over the place. I call him the battling Buddhist because he's the farthest thing from a Buddhist sage one would imagine. He's tall, muscular, has a loud, powerful voice, a shocking wave of hair. He's always gesticulating, his arms around and passion. And he's very loud and bombastic in many ways. And it's wonderful because it makes his teachings, his talks very exciting. And it was very kind of him to say that. I was kind of blown away when he did. But I don't take it literally, Victor, because I'm exhausted enough as it is doing what I'm doing.
I had the pleasure of interviewing him a couple of years ago, and I know exactly what you're talking about. So, yeah. So what inspired your new book, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance? Well,
it would not be unfair to say that this book has taken me close to 60 years to write, about 55, because I mentioned this before the incident of being turned on by the Tao Ching, the great ancient Chinese book of wisdom, and Marshall McLuhan, whose nickname was the Oracle of the Electronic Age, the medium is the message. Around that time, I also got blown away by the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I've been wanting to write about all three of those things for a long time. I've talked about them on the radio and in my live talks, but I really wanted to set it down on paper. But what really, really instigated this, because my subtitle is Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. While I love the World Wide Web from its very inception, I know you and still don't know very much about computers. And I'd given talks at a salon up here in the Woodstock area, and the gentleman who put those together, by the name of Ed Rosenfeld, had been writing an AI newsletter since the 80s. And he scheduled a talk at the salon about updating us. This is around 2018, updating us on the world of AI. And I said, it's about time I learned more about this. And I was expecting kind of a nerdy technical talk that I would need toothpicks to keep my eyes pried open to stay attentive to. But in fact, he made it very down to earth and interesting. And while I couldn't tell you any detail about what Ed talked about, I just left there saying, this is you can't understand. We can't understand the age we're in if we don't have some understanding of how AI is influencing the human mind. And so that's when I started giving more talks about the relationship between AI and the human mind, and eventually my book, The Quantum and the Dream.
Before we close out this segment, tell us a little bit more about the influence that Marshall McLuhan had on you and why his thoughts are still important today.
Oh, you know, he was a trickster as well as a brilliant guy. For people who don't remember him, Marshall McLuhan was an obscure literary professor. When he started writing books that got a lot of attention about how modern media rewire the human brain and get us to think and see the world in new and expansive ways. No one else had really done that. And when I read his book, The Medium is the Message, I did not understand most of it, other than it was important. And so I started listening to his talks. And ever since then, for the past 50 years, every couple of months, I'll YouTube one of his talks. I'll reread parts of his book. How amazing was Marshall McLuhan? He was the most sought after visionary in the 1960s and the early part of the 1970s during that whole revolutionary cultural transformation. He was the most sought after speaker. And he was kind of like a Zen master in that he had a sense of humor. And if he felt the interviewer was using too much ego or whatever, he would just throw spitballs at him, little jokes. And he loved jokes and humor and satire. And in fact, anyone who watches Annie Hall, the Woody Allen movie, there's a scene where Woody Allen actually goes off camera and drags Marshall McLuhan onto the screen to tell a professor on a movie line that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And Marshall McLuhan was mentioned every week on a show called Laugh-In during the late 1960s, the most popular comedy show of that era. That's how he transcended culture and the idea. And what he basically was teaching us is that he said, you can't understand the 1960s revolution, cultural revolution, without understanding how TV affects the human mind. And he anticipated the arrival of the personal computer. He died in 1980, the first year we saw personal computers. And a lot of the folks like Steve Jobs, who were tinkering with computers in their garages in the 70s, were consulting with McLuhan because he seemed to have a better take on where media was taking us than anybody else. And to this day, I feel that he is speaking to us in many ways that contemporary people can't even get to.
I remember Artie Johnson on Laugh-In saying, "Hey, Marshall McLuhan, what are you doing?" Remember that?
Every week.
Every week.
How many intellectuals have that happen to them, right?
Absolutely.
That's how people, they didn't understand him other than they knew he was important. And so I had the good fortune, Victor, I know we're coming to an end of a segment. And as a radio guy, I know time rules us. McLuhan, I had the good fortune to start a project in the 1990s. And I saw an article in Rolling Stone, and it was a quote by a gentleman who was one of the key executives of the Marshall McLuhan Center. This is well after Marshall had died. And I called him up. And for the next year, every Friday, he would call me up to get away from his family and talk to me about McLuhan. He was McLuhan's last PhD student and personal assistant. So I had that advantage because McLuhan's not easy to understand. And, I was able to get some of those insights into my book, which made me feel good.
My guest is Douglas Grunther. His brand new book, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. Doug, please share with our listeners where they can get your book, your website, and find out more about all the wonderful work that you do.
Well, I appreciate that. The book can be bought on Amazon, or it can be ordered at any bookstore. And they can also go to my website, douglasgrunther.com, which right now is basically a landing page for the book. It explains the book a bit, gives some insights into the book, and there's a way there to click and order it. So it's douglasgrunther.com, or Amazon or any bookstore can order it for any of your listeners, and appreciate the opportunity to mention that.
And can they listen to your radio show?
Well, if they have a good, strong seatbelt, yes. We're on Sunday mornings live from 7 to 9 a.m., which is a time I never would wake up myself. But fortunately, enough people do to keep me going on the radio. Radio Woodstock, which can be heard over any computer at radiowoodstock.com. You live in Queens. It's just out of our radio range. It's 100.1 FM. Radiowoodstock.com. It can be accessed and heard over the web.
And we'll be back with more of Doug after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. Om Times Radio. IOM FM. Om Times Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization. Their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Om Times, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Douglas Grunther. His book, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. Your book makes references to the phenomenon called synchronicity, which Carl Jung defined as meaningful coincidences without causal connection. Please give us some interesting examples.
Again, I get goosebumps about this. We've all had experiences with this, Victor. The sort of simpler, common synchronicity would be you're thinking of someone you hadn't talked to in a long time, and the next day they call you or email you. Did we cause that to happen? I don't think so, but it feels too meaningful to be just a coincidence. And Carl Jung, the great, probably the most influential psychologist of the 20th century, coined the word synchronicity. He also, his more poetic description was a falling together in time. And the reason he got so fascinated is because of an experience he wrote about in his autobiography. And if I could repeat it, it's an amazing synchronicity. He was considered the most successful psychologist in Europe. This was now during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He had learned at the side of Freud, but had broken with Freud to expand the notion of the unconscious. And he had this one client who he could not help. She was a wealthy aristocratic woman, and she would come every week to her sessions. They were getting nowhere. And he was about to say to her at the next session, we've tried hard. It's not working. I suggest you try something else. And at that last session, she was telling him about a dream she had where she was in ancient Egypt, and somebody presented her with a beautiful jewel in the shape of a scarab beetle. In ancient Egypt, the scarab beetle was considered a sign of good fortune. And as she's relating this dream, Jung hears a tapping sound on his office window. He goes over, and there was an insect banging against the window. And he saw it was a beetle that is the closest in Europe that looks like a scarab beetle. So he opened the window and was able to grab onto it. He walked over to the woman, opened his hand, and said, "Madam, there's your scarab beetle." It so freaked her out that she loosened up and started talking about the real issues she had wanted to come there for, and they ended up having very successful therapy. And it was that event that Jung wrote about that got him so fascinated that, as I loved finding out about and writing in my book, he spent over 2 decades in a regular conversation, both in letters and in person, with Wolfgang Pauli, who had received a Nobel Prize in physics for quantum theory, nominated for his Nobel Prize by Albert Einstein. Doesn't look bad on your resume. And Pauli, a scientist, was freaked out by his dreams and sought Carl Jung out for that. Carl Jung was fascinated by quantum theory because it seemed to resonate with how the unconscious works. So they would get together and they were both convinced that there was a bridge or gateway between the unconscious mind and the quantum realm. And my book traces these two parallel paths beginning in the year 1900 right up to the present day as a really interesting way to take a deeper look at what might be going on.
And we'll discuss more about quantum theory in a minute. I just want to share with you something that my life has been blessed with so many synchronicities, I can't even count them. One of these days, I'll put them into a book. But in 1975, I was in the Air Force. I was stationed in Seoul, Korea, 6,000 miles away from New York. And one morning I woke up and I heard in my head, Mom needs to hear from you. She's got an issue. She needs to hear from you. So I called. I always listened to that voice when I would hear that voice. And in those days, we had extension telephones, and my mother and sister back in New York picked up the phone simultaneously. And I said, Mom, is there anything wrong? And my sister says, oh, my God, how did he find out? It turned out she was scheduled for major surgery the next day, and the voice told me to tell her she'd have a complete, successful surgery, very rapid healing, complete healing, everything would be fine. She needed to hear that from me. Now, 6,000 miles away, without any warning, I hadn't had a conversation with her in a couple of months at that point. Again, this is wonderful gift that if we are, I believe it's something that we're all able to access, and it's just a question of listening.
It's a fabulous story, and there are books out that do nothing but compile incidences like this. No one I know truly understands it, but for me, when the most influential psychologist of the 20th century is in constant conversation with one of the most brilliant quantum minds of the 20th century, and they're convinced that these synchronicities, these psychic experiences are showing us that there are deep connections we can tap into. When you have a psychologist and a scientist agreeing, it doesn't mean they're right, but it certainly means there's enough there for us to pay attention and see if we can't follow up in some way. That's a fabulous story, and glad your mother turned out okay.
Thank you. So let's talk more about quantum theory. For listeners not familiar with it, please explain it in layman terms if possible, and give some examples.
Well, the only way I can do it is in layman's terms because I'm not a scientist, and I make that clear in my book. But as anybody who reads a brilliant book like The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra, or The Dancing Goulet Masters, or many others, will find out that the brilliant scientists, the physicists who first discovered quantum theory, 4 of them, including the aforementioned Wolfgang Pauli, was interested in dreams. Niels Bohr, who's considered the father of quantum theory, was fascinated by the Tao Ching and ancient Eastern spiritual wisdom. Werner Heisenberg, who was the author of The Uncertainty Principle, was a serious meditator. These are not coincidences, okay? Because there's an amazing affinity between what they were discovering at the quantum level, which I'll get into, and what spiritual explorers have been discovering for millennia in Buddhist texts, Hindu texts, Kabbalistic texts, Gnostic texts, Sufi texts, etc. And what they discovered, and they proved it, and quantum theory is the most successful scientific theory of all time. It's the reason, Victor, that you and I can talk right now over a World Wide Web, because it's based on quantum physics. Richard Feynman, who a more contemporary scientist in the 80s and 90s, who got a Nobel Prize in quantum physics, famously said, anyone who says they understand quantum physics doesn't. Okay, and he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist. But when you look at what happened at what they called the Solvay conferences in the 1920s, where Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg and these brilliant scientists would gather once a year to talk about their latest discoveries and what they might mean, you discover that they were as interested in the philosophical, empathic, and spiritual implications of quantum theory as they were the actual mathematics and the hard science of it. That quantum theory works is obvious. It's the most successful scientific theory of all time. But the mysteries of what it's implying is something we wrestle with the same way that the ancient mystics did. The three key principles of quantum theory, the first is called wave-particle duality. And it's almost like a Zen koan, because it turns out that light, which was Einstein's main focus, light, it was assumed it consists of waves. This was proved by Maxwell in the 19th century. And yet when Max Planck was working on an advanced light bulb, he discovered, to his dismay, that under certain conditions, light appears as particles. Now, particles and waves are totally different entities. Particles have very clear definitions and beginning and endpoints. We can define an individual particle. A wave is a force that just spreads out. And the quantum theorists were trying to figure out, how could it possibly be that sometimes wave appears to us as particles and other times as waves? That makes no sense. But that's one of the ways that nature works. Light and electrons that make up electricity can sometimes be particles, sometimes waves, and they seem to change when observed. Okay. The other is the uncertainty principle, which states basically that if one measures the speed of a quantum entity, one can't know its position. If one checks out its position, it can't know its speed. So there's no such thing as certainty in this world. And the third one, to me, is the most interesting, and I couldn't wait to write about it. And it's called entanglement. Now, in normal language, in normal life situations, entanglement is a negative. But at the quantum theory, it's awesome, because the implication of quantum theory was they didn't have the tools and the technology to really prove or disprove it in the 1930s. The implication of quantum theory was that at the quantum level of reality, there's no such thing as separation. There's no such thing as locality. It's non-local, meaning there's no such thing as here or there. Everything in the universe is a connected matrix or web. And Einstein, the brilliant Einstein, who I champion for his use of the right hemisphere and his incredible thought experiments, couldn't accept this. And he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to disprove it. 10 years after Einstein died, it was proven, theoretically. And in the 1980s, it was proven in a laboratory that entanglement is real. And this gives some credence to the great spiritual wisdom traditions, which state that, like the Buddha said, if you get underneath the ego, you discover that everything is connected. There's no such thing as a self. Different wisdom traditions have different ways of expressing it. And it certainly doesn't feel or seem that way at our normal level of what we call reality, right? Our everyday life. But what we call reality is just simply our limited version of reality. And scientists and philosophers would agree that the quantum theory gets deeper into reality, and at the quantum level, everything is entangled. And isn't it interesting that here in the 21st century, you and I are talking over a World Wide Web, which entangles over 5.5 billion brains around the world and growing.
And even before the World Wide Web, back in 1975, when I was in Seoul, Korea, and my mother was 6,000 miles away, I knew that I had to call her because something was wrong. Non-locality.
So we could say that synchronicity or psychic illumination or calling from your unconscious, right, is part of quantum entanglement. We haven't been able to prove that, but the implications are there. And certainly what I show in my book, and I'm glad that people have found it entertaining as well as thought-provoking, is that in the year 1900, I propose that a huge, important synchronicity happened. which has not been written about before. At the very beginning of that year, and we could say, Victor, with some certainty that the year 1900 was the first year of the modern age, the shift from the Victorian age to the modern age. Well, isn't it interesting that at the very beginning of that first year of the modern age, Sigmund Freud publishes The Interpretation of Dreams, which is one of the most 20 influential books of the 20th century on just about any list you look at. It changed music, it changed art, it helped stimulate the whole surrealistic movement, the 12-tone music movement, inspired Carl Jung to discover the collective unconscious. At the very beginning, when Freud publishes that book, at the very end of that same year, Max Planck, who didn't know who Freud didn't know who Planck was, discovers the mysterious quantum level of reality. And it was so mysterious that he wouldn't publish a paper on the mysterious part. He only published the fact that he was able to create a more efficient light bulb, which was his job. He was freaked out by the fact that quantum theory seemed to be a paradox. It was Albert Einstein who developed the first quantum theory of light, because Einstein, like a great Zen master, loved paradox. It was a way to play with reality. And that gets back to what you and I agree on. You have to be playful to understand deeper levels of reality.
My guest is Douglas Grunther. His book, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. We'll be back with more after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Douglas Grunther. His book, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. Let me ask you, your book is based on 3 shifts in consciousness. The first is the shift from left hemisphere of our brain to the right hemisphere. How are these 2 hemispheres different? And why is it particularly important to know this here in the 21st century?
Well, now I know, thanks primarily to the work of a brilliant contemporary visionary, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, in his book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And Ian, who I got a chance to interview, has a fabulous background. He was a literary professor at Oxford, and he got so frustrated by the way his colleagues were teaching literature as if it was something to be analyzed, like a science, that he resigned and attended medical school at the age of 30, became a psychiatrist, got interested in neurology, was able to get a funding to go to Johns Hopkins and study the brain for years, and then spent 10 years writing this book about primarily the distinction between the left and right hemispheres of the human brain. And he has over 1,700 footnotes. It's a very well-researched book. And what he shows is that most of what we thought we knew about the left and right hemisphere are wrong. Every living organism brain is divided into a left and right hemisphere. There are other parts as well. But one who's curious would want to ask, why would nature and evolution give all living organisms a left and right hemisphere of the brain that are clearly divided? And he figured it all out and did a lot of research. And it turns out the misunderstanding is that the left hemisphere of our brain is rational and verbal, and the right hemisphere is creative. No, both can be creative, both can be rational, but they look at the world through a totally different lens. Now, Ian didn't have to prove to us. We know when you hear the differences that Western culture for hundreds of years has given more precedence to the left hemisphere. That's the part of our brain that sees the world as a series of objects to be manipulated. And that was crucial to our caveman ancestors who didn't have weapons greater than stones and sticks, and there were predators faster and stronger than they were. So they had to be on guard all the time and really focus on finding seeds and nuts and fruits because they didn't even know about gardening and agriculture back then. And it's the left hemisphere that science uses to do laboratory experiments and come up with technical innovations, all of which has improved all of our lives. But the left hemisphere of our brain, Victor, cannot see the forest for the trees. It's very tuned into specific details. It doesn't see the big picture. And that's the reason that while fossil fuel technology has given us amazing comforts, right, and protections in modern life, it's now destroying the very ecosphere that keeps us and other living creatures alive. We miss the big picture. The right hemisphere of our brain is physically larger than the left. It's more intricately wired than the left. That should be a clue. And it's the part of our brain that sees the world as one big unified picture. And so it understands the world not like a watchmaker taking it apart and putting it together, but by using intuition, by using empathy, by using emotional resonance, by tuning us in the way your mind did when you got that message from your mother 6,000 miles away. This is the right hemisphere of the brain because it doesn't have to try to explain and analyze why that happened. The left hemisphere wouldn't have accepted it because it doesn't make sense rationally. We need both hemispheres, but the point I'm making in my book is computers are already better than us at left hemisphere thinking, which is to retrieve information and analyze it. That's what we needed to do for thousands of years, but computers are already better at it. We're needed for the right hemisphere, which the computers can't imitate because computers, as brilliant as they are, their intelligence is mechanized. Human intelligence is embodied in a series of emotions and this right hemisphere of the brain. And so if we get it right, we will stop competing with AI and start collaborating with it by using its left hemisphere proclivities with our right hemisphere. And so that distinction between left and right hemisphere is crucial. And if I can give kind of a fun example of it, why did Albert Einstein become the first person to discover relativity, which no one else came close to understanding? As is well known, Victor, Einstein was not a great student. He was a right hemisphere thinking, and most academics is left hemisphere oriented. Here's how you do things. Do it the way we tell you, and we'll give you a good grade. Einstein was a rebel, so he couldn't get a job in academia, so he took a job in a patent office. It made enough money to support his family and gave him a lot of time to do what he called thought experiments. We now know this is like a creative visualization in the right hemisphere of the brain. And his most famous was he chased a light beam. He said, I wonder what it would be like to chase a light beam, since he was fascinated by light and the quantum paradox of light could be a particle at some times and a wave at others. So he wanted to play with that. And he created a thought experiment where he imagined chasing a light beam. And in his imagined vision, when he caught up to the light beam, time stopped. So he went, maybe that's his brain telling him that light is the fastest thing in the universe. He is also quoted as saying, and I have the quote in my book and the reference to where he said it, my entire career is based on a dream I had when I was 11 years old. This is Einstein. And the dream is very short. He was 11 years old. He dreams he's sledding down a hill and he's getting more. It's a super sled. He's getting faster and faster. And as he starts going ridiculously fast, suddenly the sky explodes into all kinds of fabulous colors. Well, his 11-year-old brain didn't understand what that meant, but he intuitively understood that that was important. And so he combined the intuitive response to that dream, where as he sped closer and closer to the speed of light, light refracted, to his creative experiment where he chased a light beam in his mind and time stopped with his limited view of mathematics and came up with E equals MC squared before anyone else did. Now, I'm not saying that if we access the right hemisphere of our brain, we're going to be Einsteins, but we're going to start having more experiences like you had 6,000 miles away from your mom, like I've had dozens of times with synchronicities in my life. In fact, there's a synchronicity is the reason you and I are talking right now.
Absolutely.
But, the shift from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere of the brain is absolutely crucial if we're going to make it to a new renaissance. And I describe the right hemisphere of the brain as the ultimate playground of visionary insight and new ideas.
What would you like readers to take away from The Quantum and the Dream?
I think the most fascinating thing I discovered, an important thing, was, and a lot of it goes to the credit of Lynn Margulis, who's not as well known as she should be. She had a great nickname, the Angry Earth Mother. She loved that. As she said, I love men, but I don't take crap from any of them. She got her PhD in biology during the 60s when it was a man's world. And her theory was ridiculed until she proved it. What she proved is that mitochondria, these minuscule bacteria and viruses, which, by the way, is what we're mostly composed of, for millions of years, ancient bacteria and viruses and microbes figured out, took millions of years, how to collaborate. Now, if you look at the surface of any bacterial world, you see what you see in the jungles of animals and in the human world of constant warfare, right? We've been at war since we've been around. You'll see microbes attacking one another, eating one another, defending their territory against others. But under the surface, Lynn Margulis's intuition proved out that over millions of years, microbes learned that if they collaborate, they both profit. And it happened because one microbe ate another one, but the microbe didn't die. It stayed alive, and that organism was able to use its abilities that of the microbe it swallowed with its own. And so they didn't have brains. They weren't thinking this through. It's through a process called self-organization, which is part of nature's intelligence. But she proved that at the bacterial level of life, evolution keeps pulling entities towards more complex, novel forms of collaboration. And that's just as true in human evolution. Yes, we're constantly at war with each other. We're still not as empathic and loving to each other as we ought to be. But the fact is that Yuval Noah Harari, the most popular historian on the planet, who wrote *Sapiens*, what does his book show? The reason we're the most powerful animals on the planet is not because we're the fastest. We wouldn't do well against a dog, a cat, or a cheetah. We're not the strongest. We're not even the most industrious. Ants are much more industrious than we are. But we, Harari showed, can collaborate beyond our family nature. We can collaborate with each other. And that's the gift that nature's intelligence gives to us. Now, it often doesn't look like we're collaborating, but as I point out in my book, the Italian Renaissance, that magnificent hundreds of years of not just great art, but the invention of science with Galileo and the creation of the humanist philosophy, which for the first time in 1,000 years celebrated the individual human mind, which was basically squashed during the entire Middle Dark Ages. That Renaissance happened at a time when less than 1% of citizens were literate, when the fastest form of communication, written communication, was hand scribing a manuscript. Okay? They created a renaissance, and it was during the Black Plague on its way to killing a third of Europe, and they didn't know the cause. If they could figure out a way to collaborate under those conditions in the 14th to 16th century, I think we have a pretty good chance in the age of the World Wide Web, which I celebrate in the book, despite all of its consequences and frustrations. If we can't, with the amount of literacy in the world and with billions of people, including visionaries, people like you who are fascinated by synchronicities and resonances at a deep level are communicating all the time under the noise of the 24/7 news cycle. Just like the microbes who learn to collaborate under all the fighting and fights to the death and fighting for territory. And so I point out in my book, visionaries who are doing this work under the 24/7 news cycle as we're speaking and are finding new and complex ways for human beings to collaborate. And it doesn't always look that way because in many ways we're in a dark age similar to the conditions that brought about the Italian Renaissance with the Black Plague. We now have what we politely call global warming, which is already wreaking havoc. But I feel, and I give evidence, that we are being pointed by evolution towards a new renaissance. And conversations like you're creating here, Victor, are the reason I feel we're going to be able to get there.
My guest, Douglas Grunther, his book, The Quantum and the Dream. Doug, one more time, please share with listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your wonderful work.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. The book is called The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. It was published October 1st. It's available on Amazon or can be ordered at any bookstore. And also on my website, douglasgrunther.com, which explores and explains a little bit more about the book. It's been a thrill to write it. It's given me a chance to talk to people like you, Victor. And I hope our paths cross in the future.
Absolutely. Doug, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this wonderful message.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Furman. Have a wonderful week.